Fantastic. Thanks so much for having us. So basically, I'm going to start by sharing my screen, if it works. Excellent. Can everyone see that? Fantastic. Excellent. So to introduce us, my name is Ben Collier. I'm presenting today with Daniel Thomas, although this research is a collaboration between Strathclyde and Edinburgh, and including our co-researchers, Gemma Flynn and James Stewart of Strathclyde and Edinburgh, respectively. Apologies if I've got a very nice little dog here. We've just got who maybe makes some barking noises throughout. So we'll see. But yeah, so essentially we're going to be talking today about this report that we did based on a couple of years worth of research, which started when Daniel and I were down together as fresh-faced postdocs at Cambridge in the computer lab there. And it's called the talk's called Influence Government, Target Advertising and Prevent Criminal Justice and Beyond. And what we're going to look at today is to talk about how target advertising and what's called sort of influence campaigns or sort of covert influence campaigns are now being used by police and security services and by everyone else. And with this started off looking at the sort of law enforcement side, but actually every government department is doing this, certainly central government, and lots of local government, local police are starting to use these type of behavior change, digital influence campaigns. So the background to this is that discussions around sort of the platform advertising model, so where you get access to things like Facebook and Twitter for free, but they collect your data and use it to develop these very intimate profiles of you that are used to target adverts. There's been a lot of criticism of these. So criticism of the use by corporations because of the privacy aspects there. Criticism of the use by political campaigns. So we see sort of particular critiques around sort of Cambridge Analytica, the use in the Brexit and the Trump the Trump election essentially. But there's very little, and also in the use for disinformation, but there's very little discussions really of their use by government specifically to shape people's behavior. And we really see the sort of emergence of them as a new technology of control, which we describe as influence government. So effectively it's a merging of behaviorist forms of government with these influence infrastructures, which we'll explain. So we think this is a sort of really, in some ways, quite shocking and sort of worrying phenomenon, which has clearly got some potential for good and some potential for bad. But I'm going to hand over now to Daniel, who's going to talk about kind of where we came from with this, how we kind of initially found out about it. And then after that, I'm going to discuss further where we are now.
Okay. Great. Okay. So this is how we got into this work. So we were measuring global cybercrime levels for a particular specific crime type, which is UDP reflection distributed denial of service attacks. And you don't need to know about how those work. There's a diagram on here that shows you how it works, but I'm not going to talk about that. The important thing is that we can measure how many of these attacks are going on and who the victims are across the whole world with a reasonably good degree of accuracy. And that's quite an unusual thing for a crime type. You can't normally see all the crime that's going on everywhere. You have some proxies for it, but having a global view with per country resolution is pretty good. And we do this using a network of honeypots. These are computers that pretend to be things that attackers could use to do these attacks. They don't really do these attacks, but they give this impression, and this gives us this data. And so we can see what's going on with this particular crime types. It's all very well to say, oh, it goes up, it goes down, but actually what we want to know is, do the interventions that are supposed to disrupt this particular crime type work? We want to evaluate the interventions that law enforcement or other organizations make to try and reduce these attacks because they are quite disruptive. And because this is a kind of a rare crime type where we've got this really good visibility into how many there are, it's easier to do this kind of evaluation for this crime type than for many other crime types. And perhaps some of the results that we get from these understanding these interventions might be applicable to other harder to measure crime types. We will have to see basically how that goes. But that's what we were doing. I think we go to the next slide now. Too far. So we were able to do this linking. So this graph shows the weekly attack volume recorded globally. And then the blue line is the seasonally adjusted trend over that period, and then the orange line lines up for the interventions, and these are statistically significant decreases that deviate from the trend across the rest of the data. Once you've accounted for things like Easter and holidays and stuff, there's a lot of stuff going on. And we were able to find a number of interventions that have been made that were supposed to reduce the number of these attacks had in fact succeeded in reducing these attacks, or at least there's reasonably good evidence that that appears to have happened. And that was exciting. It meant that maybe some of these things do work. And then Ben in particular was then able to go and collect some of the qualitative data and do some interviews and things like that were able to help us understand why some things worked and some things didn't work so well. And so we've got some analysis of this in the paper listed at the bottom. And then I think we go next slide. So that qualitative and quantitative combination has led to some other exciting global results. So one of the things that we found is that crime is often boring, and there's a great paper about that you should read that was published this year in the British Journal of Criminology. And then we also had some there's some more work looking at this influence and infrastructure work that's published in Policing and Society, but that was all about the global stuff, really. Like, this is based on the global data, and what's going on at the per country data, because we can see not only how many attacks are there across the whole world, but also how many attacks are there in any individual country in the world, and how those vary, those behave differently depending on factors that affect particular countries. So let's go to the next slide. So we've been doing some work with the NCA, or we've been talking to them on a regular basis, and they told us that they'd run a Google Ads campaign for 6 months that was aimed at stopping people getting involved in distributed denial of service attacks, because they're worried this is a key pathway into serious cybercrime, as well as being illegal and disruptive. And so we had a look in this our per country data for the UK, which is not, we wouldn't necessarily have spotted this if we hadn't gone looking. And we discovered that during this 6-month period, the levels of attacks in the UK did not increase. Before this period started and after this period ended, attack levels in the UK were highly correlated with the US, and the US attacks increased across this 6-month period. So it appears that during this period where these adverts were being shown, the UK attack levels were suppressed. They were kept constant rather than increasing as other countries such as the US did. And so on the chart, you can see that the 6-month period is shown in grey. The UK and UK levels are in blue, and the US levels are in orange, and these are indexed, so 100. And that, as Ben's indicating, is where the indexation point. And the attack levels in the US are much higher than in the UK, but the relative levels are highly correlated. The NTA really liked this because it meant that they'd spent not very much money and got a significant effect, and they were very happy about that, because most things they do are much more expensive and much less effective. But we suddenly went, evidence bases. Do we? This is a kind of good indication that perhaps something useful is happening here, but there's more going on. And is this really a strong evidence base? And it's all very well saying this works, or this might work, but how do you then govern this? There were a whole load of ethical issues that arise. And so having opened the can of worms, or at least shown that the can of worms was there, we then had an obligation to then dig a bit deeper and work out what is going on in government. They're doing these things, and then what should they be doing if that might be different from what they are doing. And so that's where we're going to go next. I think Ben is taking back over now.
Oh, so yeah, really great summary, I think, Daniel, of the kind of history of the work. So at this point, we sort of started interviewing the NCA. We started talking about actually how these campaigns are conducted. Because initially we thought, well, it does sound quite science fiction-y, the NCA using Google Ads to stop crime. But it turned out to be really, we initially thought, oh, well, it's just going to be they're buying the ads and that's it. But it turned out to be a really sophisticated campaign. So it wasn't simply they were just buying ads and using it as a sort of, like you would with a normal awareness campaign. They conceived of these as actually very sophisticated influence operations. So it's not just a simple message, it's a message in immediate context. So this was a message that they use all the capacities of Google's ad targeting infrastructure to target very particular groups of the population. So young men within a particular age bracket with particular interests, with particular histories within the UK. And they target them not just all the time, but when they search for particular terms. So they were targeting these very specific groups with very tailored messaging in a really specific context. So when they were actually looking for these illegal services. And they blend loads of operational data. So at this time, they were also sort of scooping up lots of people, mostly kids, using surveillance to find out kids who were getting involved in sort of very low-level cybercrime or sort of pre-cybercrime stuff that's not actually illegal. And then they sort of, they debrief them, they do these long police interviews with them. They find out not only things about them, so additional things you can target on, but also things like sort of what they're listening to, what they're watching, stuff that can be used to target and tailor advertising. So we see this kind of, it's really interesting. It's almost like an ad agency, but housed within the police, well, the National Crime Agency. This sort of iterative cycle between sort of focus groups, surveillance, individual interventions, and then all this feeding into the messaging. And they're using sort of quite sophisticated techniques of profiling and audience segmentation, but also this sort of cultural knowledge that's coming out of the interviews, and they're actually developing across these sort of pseudo-academic theories of change, theories of offending. So we can go to the next slide. So we kind of dug a bit deeper into this. So this kind of the theory behind using advertising in this way, it's not just the same as awareness messaging. This is actually, the theory behind it is what's often known as nudge theory. So we see nudge sort of emerge around the time of the global financial crisis. We have this big sort of crisis in sort of neoliberal governance, where people think, oh God, maybe this hands-off regulation isn't doing so well, but we still want to preserve some of the sort of founding tenets of neoliberalism. And so they come up with this idea of nudge, which they describe as libertarian paternalism, which obviously sounds like a bit of an oxymoron. But this is the idea that you can still let people make their own choices, but instead what you do is you embed lots and lots of different social policy all around them in the architecture that shapes their individual decisions. So you shape the material conditions, including things like tweaking the built environment in all these ways, but also drawing on this sort of grab bag of ideas from marketing, individual psychology, economics, and also some sort of stuff from like Cold War psyops and things like that, as to how you actually allow people to make their own decisions, but shape and nudge them to make those decisions in different ways. This is often associated with the rise of the behavioural insights team in government, which was introduced under the man on the right there, David Cameron, which has now sort of been spun off out of government into this extremely influential policy sort of collective, or whatever you want to call it, who don't necessarily always come up with fantastic ideas, I have to say. But yeah, so from this nudge has been written into things like alcohol minimum unit pricing, changing tobacco labeling, things like this. And they also tend to claim that whatever works turned out to be nudge all along. So we see them claiming the results of the VRUs as a big, the violence reduction units in Glasgow is a big victory for nudge, even though it's not really nudge. But as you can imagine, this is a bit of a contested relationship with democracy. You're not really providing support to people in a lot of ways through these nudge campaigns. And also, I think a lot of people would argue that it's not necessarily the right way around if government is trying to shape and influence how we think and behave rather than the other way around. And at the same time, you've got this, so that's the kind of nudge idea. And at the same time, across this period from about before 2008, but it's emerging over the last sort of 10 years, we have this targeted ads ecosystem. So with the idea of sort of surveillance capitalism, where we have these massive internet platforms who've put this extensive, essentially surveillance infrastructure that we use to communicate with each other. And they track us through cookies and other data, what we do online, what we spend money on, what our beliefs and the sort of textures of our lives are. And this is all packaged up and sold in complex secondary and tertiary advertising markets to deliver advertising. And at the same time, they leverage their understanding of social networks to pick out particular individuals, influencers, who are at key points in these networks, and you can buy their services as well. So you can say, if you are particularly influential on social media, someone can pay some money to sell some products. And we see this sort of developing as a cycle. So you can do all this automatically. You put out a message to your target group, and it'll automatically split the population in half, do A/B testing, message 1, message 2, and then you can just select the message automatically that seemed to work best. And then you just do that iteratively. So we see a lot of these campaigns end up, it's why you get really weird adverts for stuff where it looks like a sort of half a person's stomach and a giraffe or weird text that doesn't seem to make any sense. It's because these kind of algorithms have automatically generated stuff they think people are going to click on. But again, most of the critical work on this is around politics and commercial advertising, not around government policy. So there's quite a lot of research on nudge and behaviourism, but we're really interested in looking at the incorporation of these sort of sophisticated marketing, surveillance, and segmentation infrastructures and practices to actually deliver these nudge campaigns, these behaviour change campaigns. And moving on to the NCA, I mean, we were kind of thinking at the time that, so in the context of this research, this is when Dominic Cummings had just come into number 10 as a senior advisor. And we thought, well, if the NCA are doing this and it's a sort of known quantity, then presumably Dominic Cummings and his pals from Cambridge Analytica will be really pushing this in government. So we're interested in kind of scoping out what was going on. And it turned out we were completely wrong. So this wasn't coming from Dominic Cummings at all. This was already widely established, the use of these sorts of digital influence campaigns within government. And we found sort of 4 what we could call ideal type forms, each one more sophisticated and each one with increasing levels of sort of moving away from traditional forms of policy and accountability. So the first one is the sort of very naive approach. This isn't really influence government or behavioural advertising at all. This is the naive approach. So this is where you get often local councils using Google as a billboard. So they're just using a bit of their budget on Google Ads. There's no feedback or continuous development, and there's no real theory of kind of behaviourism or anything like that behind it. Now we get to something a bit more interesting, and that's professional practice. So this is where Police Scotland, National Crime Agency, and other sort of major law enforcement entities are now. So these use operational data to sort of profile and target the ads. They're often very sophisticated and sort of multi-stage campaigns, and it's rarely just the advert. So at the same time, they're sort of looking through the administrative data to see what's going on, bringing in other forms of sort of interventions to work with the ad. There is a core competency framework within the civil service, which is quite influential in shaping not only within the civil service, but actually the police as well, the use of these approaches. So the Government Communication Service has this competency framework around how you do this. And we see this sort of being reconstructed and drawn on in law enforcement. Particularly, there's this kind of productive tension between a lot of the kind of ideas behind this are coming from the extremely controversial PREVENT program, which is sort of part of the UK's counter-terror apparatus that involves essentially messaging and sort of ideological shaping around populations that they believe are at risk of becoming involved in terrorism, although of course it's been massively criticised, and pulls in all sorts of people, journalists and comms people, but also statisticians, marketing staff, etc. And we see this kind of cycle becoming more apparent. So I'm going to pause there and talk a bit about the kind of what we call the influence policing model. So this is where this is being used in policing specifically rather than other areas of policy. And we see kind of the PREVENT approach, this sort of approach to counter-radicalisation, counter-terror, spreading far beyond radicalisation to include all sorts of crimes, so cybercrime, but also knife crime, gun crime, wherever there's a kind of what's often thought of as like a crime or which the police associate with a sort of population that can be segmented and thought about and judged in terms of risk. And we call this sort of influence policing. And it comes, I won't go too much into the kind of epidemiology stuff, but it's a sort of theory of offending that treats crime as though it's sort of essentially like a disease that spreads throughout the population that you control through sort of in the same way you would a pandemic. But obviously this isn't necessarily a great way to be doing sort of policing by consent. We've talked a bit about this, so I will move on, except to say that this involves like a huge amount of data collection, often very intimate cultural pictures of particular communities. And at the same time, it's not just a negative message. There's never just a negative message where you're saying like, or very rarely where you say, don't do this, although there is a lot of that. Instead, it always provides the positive message as well, which is where you can get some of the more, I think where I get more critical as well, because this positive image of the citizen of whatever community you're in is sort of inevitably this kind of entrepreneurial, capitalist, consumerist, success-focused sort of capitalist citizen. And it can end up sometimes being quite, I guess, quite cynical, sort of state-approved versions of what are deemed as like kind of risky cultures. And here we see some adverts for sort of, this is one advert on YouTube. I've taken some stills from, just sort of anti-gun crime ad. But as we can see, there's a lot of kind of quite consumerist branding in here. I mean, it's coming from a marketing agency, so that's not necessarily to be expected. So yeah, the next sort of actor in this is that this isn't just done wholesale by the government, although some government departments do sort of basically take all the functions of this on and do the advertising themselves. But actually sort of advertising consultancy networks and partners play a really important role in this. So they are often linking to the kind of government, so government commissions them to provide creative or to buy the adverts themselves. But sometimes government gives them the ball to run with on their own. So they'll just say, we're interested in doing this, shaping behavior in this particular way, you go off and create a campaign and run it. And they do offer these kind of full feature services. They often have links to, it's not just Google ads, but also all sorts of other sort of very small social media platforms. And we see, when we look into these companies, quite weirdly high numbers of sort of Tory and Labour ex-MPs and ex-cabinet ministers, ex-civil servants. And that's, I think, because a lot of this expertise around commissioning and how you get government projects is often helped if you have someone who sort of knows people on the inside effectively. And this is where we see the kind of full advertising cycle emerge, including sort of quasi-ethnographic collection within communities and things like this. I won't dwell on this too much, but this is the kind of future of this stuff. So we're seeing these large sort of integrator companies, both sort of established players like PwC and accountancy firms and security firms like G4S, but additionally kind of newer players like Palantir, these more disruptive players, who are beginning to provide huge amounts of the infrastructure of government, so the digital infrastructure our services run on. So the way they do this is they will sell, will run big bits of the NHS data infrastructure, for example. And one of the ways they compete for these contracts is by saying, well, in addition to running this infrastructure, we'll do analytics on the data. So they pull apart sort of patient records, prisoner records, things like this, and contribute this into the analysis. Boiling them down to dashboards, things you can use to actually assure and measure policy, which when combined with these sort of influence methods, can be a very sort of powerful but very intimate and potentially problematic approach. So a brief detour into theory. So there's lots of detours in this talk. And then I'll do some sort of a quick couple of examples, and then I'll talk a bit about the ethics, and then I'll stop. So we're kind of seeing this now, this also adoption of the behaviorist epidemiological model means that in a lot of ways, comms are starting to take a much more active role directly, not only in the sort of selling policy, but also making and enacting policy. And in some places, we're finding that comms are sort of setting up these sort of policy one-stop shops where there's a policy maker will say, oh, we need a campaign around this, but then actually comms are going off and then like enacting like real policy that's meant to shape the world. And this is fusing with the new media ecosystem. So we're seeing all these sort of companies and aggregators and suppliers facilitating this. And we see this sort of, and this is the theory, basically, so in terms of, from a sort of biopolitical argument, we see these sort of three modes collapsing together or being hybridized. So firstly, you have the kind of government, the traditional biopolitics of kind of government data collected about people, prisoner records, welfare records, health records, etc. And then these are sort of turned into profiles, which then become hybridized with marketing profiles by these sort of consumer agencies. And so you get these sort of hybrid sort of consumer citizen profiles. Now that's quite long-standing. That's been going on since the 70s in social marketing. But then the new thing is that these are then being sort of projected or cast onto the surveillance advertising infrastructure. So onto the profiles and the categories that are leveraged up by the platforms. And this gives incredibly intimate and huge amounts of data you can use to actually enact government policy, but there are obviously some serious legal and privacy issues associated with this. I'll talk a bit about unforeseen consequences, but I want to give a couple of examples before I do. There's not much left. So some of the examples we found are really bizarre. I mean, so there's obviously the NCA example of, if you search for a crime, it'll give you a message telling you that crime is illegal. But we found some other absolutely bizarre stuff. So the Home Office, God bless them, they basically were targeting you based on what you buy. So if you bought, it was a fire safety campaign, you go down the shops, use your credit card to buy some candles and matches from your corner shop. You go back up to your house, and then it registers that in the advertising infrastructure, which Amazon delivers and other players. And then when you get home, your Amazon Alexa will start giving you fire safety adverts, and it'll tailor them at a time when it thinks that you are going to be sort of at home and having your tea. So I'm not sure many people think the Home Office should be able to sort of beam their voice into your bedroom or sort of base that, detect what you're buying and then sort of target in different ways. I think it is particularly dangerous because, especially when you see some of the other stuff the Home Office is doing in this space. So a campaign recently using targeted advertising, targeted not at the people in the UK, but people in France and other countries in Europe, where they targeted people looking to seek asylum in the UK. And the advert would then direct them to a website full of essentially lies, misinformation, intended to discourage people from seeking asylum in the UK. So it's these kind of things where the Home Office being able to target you based on your political beliefs, what you buy, what you read. This, I don't want to be alarmist, obviously, because not everyone is doing this, but I think it's important to recognize that when this isn't done within a proper framework of accountability, it can get extremely sinister very quickly. So some kind of unforeseen consequences we think about this is the first and most important one is accountability. So with previous, frankly, racist Home Office campaigns, including things like the Go Home vans, where they sent vans around neighborhoods with lots of kind of refugees and asylum seekers in them, saying "Go home" on the van, and things like kind of racist messaging around knife crime. These have been picked up by the press and then critically discussed and criticized because they occur in kind of real space. You can see them, you can see a van, someone else can see it, you can report it, these kind of things. However, when these types of government adverts are delivered in very intimate settings, so you kind of read them on your phone when you're on the toilet, or your Amazon Alexa whispers it into your ear while you're listening to the radio, only the people who are in these targeted groups actually receive and see the advert. And so if you're not well networked, if you don't have a lot of social capital, don't have a lot of links with sort of the ability to kind of complain about this stuff, or if you're worried about complaining about this stuff, then it'll never come to light. And there's actually a lot of this stuff going on that is, when we report it, people like, I had no idea this advert was even running. Additionally, there's this problem that, so a lot of these techniques have been based on stuff that is done by, is Cold War techniques of soft power, so sort of shaping populations, particularly populations abroad, using targeted messaging in different ways. And it has similar issues with a phenomenon known as blowback, which is where you attempt to deliver a message or an intervention and it has the opposite effect. Because people are not passive consumers of media, and that includes adverts. People are aware that adverts are targeted, and people are aware that the government is giving them an advert. And so if, for example, you realize you're being targeted because of your ethnicity, you might get quite angry, and that might actually cause you to put less legitimacy in the government, for example, things like this. And these things can provoke reactions which have the opposite effects. You also see some of this happening in the kind of counter-radicalization space, where these adverts are being deployed to kind of myth bust techniques of radicalization, so myth bust arguments used to radicalize people. But actually, when the ad goes out, instead of countering these messages, the adverts accidentally spread them to groups that would never have heard them otherwise. So my colleague Lydia Wilson at Cambridge has done a lot of really interesting research on this. It's coming up to time, so I'm not going to go through the rest of these, but there's a lot of stuff. The autism link thing there is quite interesting. So that's particularly around things like online crime. If the police have a pre-existing sort of preconception that particular groups are more disposed towards committing particular types of crime. So in this case, there's a common narrative on the police that people with autism spectrum disorder are, as their terminology, are more likely to commit online crime. There's no real scientific evidence for this, but it can lead to these kind of labeling cascades where the police target people with ads based around this stuff, and then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy essentially, because it shapes who they surveil, who they target, etc. So in conclusion, we're still doing lots of research on this. We are doing a project looking at Police Scotland's use of these techniques. And yeah, we're really interested in just hearing what people think. I think it's very early days for us with this research. We're really happy to get a piece out there, and happy to get together, because I think we heard when we did the first piece that it was sort of escalated to ministerial level with the Home Office, and they were like, oh, the Home Office loves this stuff. And they were like, God, that's not a good thing. No one likes to hear the Home Office likes the research. So we thought, okay, well, let's do the critical paper where we slag them off a bunch. So yeah, I'll finish there. But yeah, really nice. Thank you again for having us, and I hope that wasn't too rambly.
Right.